So there's a lot of familiar faces in the room, but those of you who don't know me, my name's Chris Rush. I'm the head of athletic performance at Blackburn Rovers Football Club. Been at the football club for 8 years, so hopefully, Dave, I'm not one of these black box staff, but I'm not on Twitter, so that's a benefit as well, I suppose. During that time, obviously, anybody who's aware of Blackburn over the last sort of 8 years, really, from a performance point of view on the pitch, it's obviously not been a great time. From 2012 to 2017, 2 relegations, one down from the Premier League and one down from into League One. And obviously during that time, those poor performances really create a challenging environment, a culturally challenging environment. And what I want to do with this presentation is really just produce a bit of a reflective case study on that time and talk about decisions as practitioners that we make when faced with difficult periods where the team's losing, there's unrest around a football club, and ultimately how those decisions can bear out in a good or a bad athletic performance environment, because over that period of time we've made mistakes as well as in the last 2 years trying to improve the process of what we ask and demand from our players. So that was us, 2012 to 2017. 2012, when we got relegated out of the Premier League, it was under the midst of a lot of fan unrest, a really hostile environment around the football club, protests against the owners, and in 2017, when we get relegated to League One, really we got to a stage whereby there's almost a malaise over the football club. The environment had become one whereby players and staff had become so probably demotivated with the situation that there was almost an acceptance of the fate. So as a culture, from a training point of view, it was a really, really difficult environment. And what I saw, or we saw during that time in terms of players, was when you're losing games all the time, you want to shut your mind off from the game, because it's too hard to constantly think about, well, where's the next training session coming from, what we're doing in the next training session, how am I improving as a player. And we saw that in the training environment. Players weren't coming in and being motivated by the environment, and really what we found was this get in, get out training culture. So turn up, have a little bit of breakfast, do whatever we ask them to do in the day, have a little bit of lunch and go home. So far from any sort of athletic performance development environment, far from any high performance, because the players just weren't motivated to come in and train and work hard. Now, from our side, we had to accept a responsibility in that. And ultimately, as an athletic performance department or a sports science department, the work that we do, we set standards for the players. And the minimum standards come from what we accept in terms of their body condition, the weight, the body fat levels. Do they have to come in the gym? If they don't come in the gym, are they going to get fined? If they turn up late, are they going to get fined? If they don't have the right aerobic condition, what's the process to improve it and get it to the level that it needs to be at to perform in the side? And during this period, really, we didn't have those minimum standards set. We didn't take that responsibility to say, this is what you have to be physically to be a Blackburn Rovers footballer. And because of those things, and because of the poor training culture, we developed this sort of risk-averse mentality. So because we're not producing high-performing athletes, because the training environment's not demanding enough, we start to worry about injuries, trying to prevent injuries. But prevention of injuries and durability doesn't always come from reducing training loads. It can come from, obviously, harder work, more training, more work in the gym. But because we didn't have that environment, ultimately what we did was strip back. So we asked less of the player. We were worried 2 days post-game, what were we doing? Should the players go outside? Player comes in, hamstrings are a bit sore, well, maybe don't do your gym session today. That type of mentality that over time feeds into a player, feeds into the environment, And ultimately, although in the short term it might help you avoid injury, in the long term it probably produces a less durable athlete. And really what we didn't have was this, I don't know, I think that's come out very well, but this line in the sand. So when we talk about minimum standards, we couldn't really impact specifically on the mentality of the player because it was really the results and the overall environment at the club and all the managerial change that created that mentality in the player. But what we could do was draw a line in the sand and say, what's acceptable? Where are we up here? What does this look like in terms of our processes? And what isn't good enough? And when we decide what isn't good enough, what's the repercussions to this? What are we doing? So ultimately we got to a place whereby in 2017 we get relegated to League One, and the feeling at the football club, we kind of hit rock bottom. Ultimately that isn't rock bottom, but the feeling at the football club was we've hit rock bottom. And I got the opportunity to head up the department at that point, and what was really, really important was to decide how were we going to do it different, what we were going to change, because what we had been doing just wasn't working. We'd become an environment that was really, if we had a good group of players and a good squad, which some seasons we did with good mentalities, it'd be a good environment. Players would train hard and they'd come in the gym and they'd get the work done. But at times when you've got the wrong players in the environment, really, because you have none of this minimum standards and the line in the sand, they could really get away with whatever they wanted to do and whatever the manager at the time allowed them to get away with. So what we did as a department really was to decide, and this kind of ties into Dave's presentation of a philosophy, a mission, what is the department, what do you stand for, and basically said that let's fast forward 10 years and look at who do we want to be as a department, what do we want to achieve. And listen, we're nowhere near this stuff yet. We're 2 years into a process whereby we're trying to improve ourselves to get to a level whereby what I would say Leeds have done all season is have outstanding athletes who physically dominate an opposition. That's the end goal. The perfect athlete really is, whenever we communicate to the athlete of why they're doing certain things, it falls within one of these three things. We're either trying to make you more durable, more explosive, or produce a higher work rate. But really what the point of all this is what is the environment we're trying to create? I'm not sure whether you'll be able to see all that at the back, but these were the things that acted as a checklist, a tick list for us to say, how are we going to get to a point whereby we create this perfect or good environment where players can flourish athletically and it's demanding? Now, still, 2 years on from setting this down, we're still probably not touching some of these points because we've had to prioritise certain things to make sure we get things right. And when we're talking about prioritisation of what we do, this for me is basically encapsulates everything we do as sports scientists, athletic performance coach, fitness coaches. We're either evaluating, taking data, using our technology resources to get objective information, to get conclusions about the environment, about the team, about the individual. We're using that information to then produce a plan to alter whatever it is we've worked out in this evaluation section. And then ultimately, we're going and implementing that plan. Now, when we looked at the department and what we did, we felt like we were pretty good in these areas, but probably the reason why was these two areas just rely on yourself or the department, or you can do evaluation and planning just sat in the office in front of the computer, looking at the data, writing programs. But the reality is the only practical impact comes when you do this well. So if you don't get your implementation of your plans right, these two things don't really matter. It doesn't matter what data you collect. It doesn't matter what your plan is. You've got to make this reality. And for us, we weren't necessarily finding this bridge into implementation because we didn't have those minimum standards, the things that we expected of the players that they had to do. So the first thing we did to try and improve this implementation side of the cycle was set some minimum standards, discipline procedures, and draw the line in the sand. Okay? I'm not going to go through them, but they're sort of examples of what we've done. And obviously, I understand that this is a process that has to be built with a manager. Unfortunately, we've had the same manager now for 2 years, and we've built these processes out. And the buck stops with the manager. And yet, the responsibility of our department is we go to the manager and say, these are the things that need to happen. And we'll collect the fines. We'll say who's been late, who's not turned up, whose body fat's too high, whose weight's too high, who's not in the optimal aerobic condition. And these are the processes that we're going to do if those levels are hit. So really that draws our line in the sand. Now, the reality is that's not enough. If you rate your training environment out of 10, this might make sure that it never gets worse than a 4 or a 5. But it set us at a point whereby we were better than where we'd been previously. Because regardless of the type of players that we had or their mentalities, good or bad, this line in the sand prevented a really, really poor training environment because everybody was clear and was communicated to that this is what you had to do and sign up to when you come into the building. Then the message. So when I was talking before about this risk-averse nature, the reality is it's probably short-termism to be risk-averse and worry about maybe don't do this because you're a little bit sore. I know that's simplifying it and we've got to be logical and scientific and respond to the player, but ultimately, if you put limits on a player, those limits tend to just bring players down in terms of their intensity, their effort, to the point whereby they get a mentality whereby all they do is play and recover, that's all I can do, I can't train, I can't get myself better as an athlete. So we tried to flip this message and make sure that all the communication we had with the players was centered around this, you know, trying to get more intensity. So key training days, relative to where we were, how do we get more intensity? Are we doing more small-sided game time? Are we doing additional conditioning? Are we doing, additional strength and gym work? And the bottom one really wasn't to be communicated to the players, but to be communicated to the manager that the manager ultimately wanted in his style of play and wants in his style of play, a high-pressing, intense football team. But probably to get there and develop the athletic characteristics, when I look at Tom's presentation about, what Bielsa asks for his teams, of course, it's got a risk to it. There's this risk-reward balance all the time from a training environment that you've got to make decisions on. If the manager doesn't really need a really, really athletic team, there's probably not as much benefit of taking that risk. But when the manager does, you probably want to be training a lot more and taking some of that risk to try and achieve the demands that the manager's going to place on them. Now, all this feeds into, again, if we look at the training load of the environment and rate it as a 5 out of 10, and a player's lifestyle is a 5 out of 10, the balance is there. They can recover from the training load, they can recover from the game load, and it's fine. But when we increase the training load or the demand of the environment to a 7 or 8 out of 10, if their lifestyles don't catch up, they are going to get injured, of course. They're not going to recover from what we're asking of them. So that is a really important factor that we had to start to drum into the players that because we're asking for this, there had to be an improvement here. There had to be improvement in the diligence to their diet, how they sleep, how they recover. Because if they were coming to us and saying, you know what, Rushy, this is too much. We shouldn't be running today. We're knackered. We can't do it. And I know that they've had a lads' night out on a Saturday. Some of them are up until 2 in the morning playing on the computer. why is it right to take away from the training environment because there's not been a professionalism from a lifestyle point of view? So that really was the message to the players, that we're going to ask more of you, and we're conscious of injury, therefore you've got to up your game, you've got to up your professionalism to make sure that you're not getting injured. Now, all that sort of stuff is pretty dictatorial, and it probably is an example of where we were and where we had to get to. And through last season, playing in League One, really that was what we were working on, was just getting rules, regulations, messages into players of harder work and adding things, because it's really hard to go from there to there straight away. But moving forwards, especially this season and going on from now, getting players to actually want to do the work, want to improve themselves, creating an environment where people are coming in and they're energetic, they're ready to go, they want to train, they want to improve themselves, they're coming in and asking you for more work. So going back to that, when we talk about buy-in and we look at some of these perfect environment things that we use as our checklist, establishing high personal and physical standards. Well, we've kind of done that from a dictatorial point of view, but now we've got to try and achieve that by the players driving it themselves and the players holding themselves to an accountability to get better. Creating a growth mindset. So players coming in, working because they want to be the best, not because we're telling them, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, you've got to do that. So now that kind of takes us to the next level of we create buy-in to improve that implementation. And how you do it, you know, how we've attempted to do it recently, you know, buy-in is just trying to educate players as to reasons why you train and ask them to train in a certain way, and educate them as to what an elite high-performance environment looks like. Now, for me, creating buy-in is just individually communicating to a player, because you can sit in a room and present to players, 25 players, but depending on their personality, there might be 5 players who are really motivated, listening to it, believe in it, and then a big group of them who don't really have any interest in it. And that typically isn't because of the message, it's how the message is put across. And a really good book by Brett Bartholomew, Conscious Coaching, so talking about building buy-in with athletes and teams. And in there he highlighted 16 different types of athletes and how every single one of those different types of athletes need different ways of working and different ways of communicating to and building relationships to get the best out of them. So to think that we can just take a group of 25 players and say, this is the way we're doing it, and this is, and there's no, and these are the reasons why, it's not going to work. Ultimately, you've got to individualise how you sell that programme to each and every player. What we've done at the club recently, and this is very, very early days for us, is we've been able to personality profile all the players, all the staff, to try and get an understanding across the whole club of everybody's idiosyncrasies, how we like to be communicated to, how at times we might create conflict with each other. So this is just a simple disc profile. And what it produces after a series of questions is basically a little spot in any of these areas that gives you an indication of what type of personality you are. Now, me personally, I sit in this C environment, and probably most of us in sports science and athletic performance sit in that C environment because we like to plan, we like to be logical, we like to be analytical. But what happens here is I naturally tend to have conflict with these people in here because they don't care about the plan. They don't care about what data they're being shown and what their weaknesses is from a strength and power profile. What they need is emotion and emotive language as to the reason why they're doing the program, giving them a realization from a footballing specific point of view what it's going to achieve for them. So this has been really useful from a buying point of view because it gives us actual information on better communication styles for each of these different personality traits. And ultimately, the response from a player when your communication is individualised, of what I've seen, is obviously a lot higher than just getting a group of players in a presentation and delivering that. So just to finish off, lessons really that we learned from the poor environment and maybe the poor decisions that we made along the way, and how we've tried to change that. So first and foremost, you need to have a philosophy, as Dave said. You need to know, why do you exist in the football club? Why does the department exist in the football club? If someone sits you down tomorrow and says, give me a sentence, 2 sentences on why you're here, make sure you know exactly why you're there and what you're trying to achieve. Or weatherproof your environment. So regardless of whether you've got a brilliant group of players or a terrible group of players and the environment's terrible, or weatherproof your environment so that regardless of either of those situations, there's that line in the sand, there's the procedures that everybody has to follow, everybody's got to come into the gym, everybody's got to turn up on time, everybody's got to be a certain body condition, and if there isn't, there's repercussions there for it. Avoiding putting limits on players and trying to drive the standards, take the standards up. You know, I think we've got a big responsibility as sports scientists, athletic performance coaches, that really we get looked to almost at times drive the training environment. Is that too much today? Is that too little? And being logical is important. Being scientific and looking at the data is important, of course, but also taking the responsibility that we can gradually nudge things up month on month, season on season, and providing those messages of improvement and doing more work, for me, is more important than putting limits on players and telling them what they can't do. And then finally getting the players to believe in the process. So that is really the last point of progressing through to a really, really high performance environment whereby players are coming in and they live in this world where they're there and they're working and they're improving because they want to get better, not just because we're being school teachers and telling them that they have to do it. Thank you very much for listening.